Of all the legendary American carriers lost in the Pacific, the USS Wasp is often the one history forgot. But that is a mistake, because her wreck might just be the most chillingly beautiful sight in the entire ocean. While names like Yorktown and Hornet dominate the headlines, the Wasp guards a secret 4 miles down in the abyss. In 1942, she didn't just sink. She became a floating furnace, ripped apart by internal explosions and burned until her steel glowed. She should have been reduced to a mangled heap of scrap. For 80 years, she vanished into the crushing darkness. But when the cameras of the Harvey Petrel finally illuminated her hull in 2019, they didn't find a ruin. They found a time capsule. From the vivid scorch marks still etched onto her bridge to the anti-aircraft guns still standing guard, the Wasp is a haunting paradox. A vessel that was gutted by fire, yet remains miraculously, almost defiantly intact. Today we dive into the deep to explore the forgotten carrier that refused to break. This is the wreck of the USS Wasp. To understand why the Wasp lies in such a haunting state today, we have to look back at the 7 minutes that sealed her fate and the fatal compromises made years before she ever saw a drop of salt water. It was mid-afternoon on September 15th, 1942. The Wasp was operating in the torpedo junction of the South Pacific, providing air cover for a vital reinforcement convoy heading to Guadalcanal. The sky was clear, the seas were high, and for the 2,247 men on board, it felt like just another day of tension in a long, grueling campaign. But beneath the sapphire waves, a predator was watching. The Japanese submarine I-19, commanded by the legendary Takaichi Kinashi, had found the perfect opening. At 2:44 p.m., Kinashi unleashed a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes. It is often called the most devastating torpedo spread in naval history. While 3 of those oxygen-fueled monsters missed the Wasp, traveling on to strike the battleship North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien miles away, the other 3 found their mark with surgical, lethal precision. In an instant, the Wasp's world was inverted. The first torpedo slammed into her starboard side, followed in rapid succession by 2 more. The impacts weren't just physical blows. They were the keys that unlocked the Wasp's Achilles heel. You see, to understand the Wasp, you have to understand the Washington Naval Treaty. In the 1930s, the U.S. Navy wanted more carriers, but they were running out of tonnage allowed by international law. To squeeze one more flight deck into the fleet, designers had to make a deal with the devil. They built the Wasp as a scaled-down version of the Yorktown class. They stripped away the armor. They removed the heavy torpedo bulkheads. They sacrificed the very shielding that keeps a ship alive after a hit. This was her fatal flaw. She was a heavyweight fighter with a glass chin. The torpedoes hit the Wasp in the worst possible place near her aviation fuel lines and her forward magazine. On any other carrier, the damage might have been survivable. On the Wasp, it was a death sentence. Within seconds, the Achilles heel was bleeding fire. The shock of the explosions caused the ship's gasoline system to rupture. High-octane fuel began to spray through the forward sections of the ship like a mist. All it took was a single spark. A massive internal explosion rocked the hull, lifting the 14,000-ton ship as if she were a toy. The forward elevator was blown out of its tracks. On the flight deck, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, fueled and armed for the next mission, were tossed around like confetti. The fires were instantaneous and uncontrollable. This wasn't just a fire. It was an inferno that fed on itself, turning the hangar deck into a blast furnace. The water mains were shattered. The power failed. The men of the Wasp, many of them teenagers who had never seen combat, stood in the face of a literal hellscape. They didn't have a chance to fight back. The 7 minutes of terror refers to the time it took from the first impact to the realization that the ship was lost. Captain Forrest Sherman, watching his ship turn into a volcano, realized that the fire was reaching the ammunition lockers. If they stayed, thousands would die in a single final cataclysm. At 3:20 p.m., just 36 minutes after the first hit, the order was given: abandon ship. The Wasp didn't go down quickly. She burned with a ferocity that lit up the horizon for hours, a testament to the thousands of gallons of fuel and tons of explosives trapped within her unarmored belly. Eventually, the destroyer USS Lansdowne had to step in, firing 5 torpedoes to finally put the stinging bee out of her misery. She slipped beneath the waves at nightfall, taking 193 souls and the hopes of the Pacific Fleet with her. For nearly 8 decades, the world assumed that the fires and the scuttling torpedoes had turned the Wasp into a mangled graveyard of twisted metal. But when we look at the footage from 14,000 feet down, we see something that defies logic. The ship that was burnt and scarred didn't just survive the sinking. She preserved the very scars of that afternoon in 1942. As we move from the history of the tragedy to the reality of the wreck, we begin to see how this light construction actually saved her image for the future. For 77 years, the USS Wasp existed only as a series of coordinate guesses and a fading memory in the minds of a dwindling number of survivors. She lay in the obsidian silence of the Coral Sea, resting at a depth of 14,255 feet. To put that into perspective, that is over 2.5 miles down, a place where the pressure is so immense it would crush a modern submarine like an aluminum can, and where the temperature hovers just above freezing. On January 14th, 2019, the silence was finally broken. The crew of the RV Petrel, the world-renowned research vessel funded by the late Paul Allen, arrived at the suspected site. But before they could send their remotely operated vehicle ROV into the abyss to capture high-definition footage, they had to rely on their primary tool, side-scan sonar. In the world of deep-sea shipwreck hunting, sonar is the spectral eye. It produces a ghostly golden-hued map of the seabed, revealing shapes that shouldn't be there, unnatural geometric silhouettes against the chaotic backdrop of the ocean floor. And what the sonar revealed about the Wasp was the first major shock of the expedition. When you look at the sonar maps of other sunken American carriers like the Hornet or the Lexington, you usually see a scene of absolute carnage. These ships typically broke apart as they sank, shedding massive chunks of their hulls, flight decks, and internal machinery. Their debris fields often stretch for miles, a chaotic trail of wreckage that tells the story of a violent journey from the surface to the bottom. But as the Petrel's sonar pinged the Wasp, a different image emerged. The Wasp wasn't a scattered field of ruins. She was a monolith. The sonar showed a remarkably concentrated site. While there were bits of wreckage scattered around, the vast majority of the ship appeared to be in one single, massive piece. This was the first evidence of the paradox we mentioned earlier. Despite being the most lightly built and unarmored of the fleet carriers, and despite being gutted by Hua Huan, her hull had somehow remained a cohesive unit during its 2-mile plunge. Looking closely at the sonar scans, researchers noticed a faint broken line near the center of the ship. It indicated that while the hull was one piece, it was a broken piece. The Wasp had snapped, but unlike the Hornet, where the stern tore away and drifted into the darkness, the Wasp's bow and stern had stayed together, held by a few remaining ribbons of steel, landing on the seabed, like a fractured spine that refused to let go. The sonar also gave us a hauntingly clear look at the flight deck. In 1942, that deck was a chaotic scene of fire and melting aluminum. But on the sonar, the grid was unmistakable. Even at a scale where a human would be a mere speck, you could see the outlines of the aircraft elevators frozen in their final positions. It looked like a ghost ship waiting for planes that would never return. Surrounding the hull, the sonar revealed a halo in the silt, a perfect, nearly circular impact site. When a ship as massive as the Wasp hits the bottom, it creates a localized underwater sandstorm of epic proportions. The silt settles in a specific pattern, documenting the exact moment the ship's journey ended. It is the ocean's way of marking a grave, but perhaps the most chilling detail on the sonar wasn't the ship itself, but what lay just beyond her shadow. A few small, angular shapes were visible on the flat seabed. Even at this extreme depth and resolution, the silhouettes were recognizable. Grumman TBF Avengers. These planes had been blown off the deck or dragged down with the ship, and now they lay in the mud wings, outspread like sentinels guarding the Wasp's final resting place. The sonar analysis confirmed one thing: the USS Wasp was not a mangled heap of unrecognizable scrap. She was a preserved monument. The lack of a major debris field meant that the meat of the video, the actual visual exploration, would be far more intense than anyone expected. The ship was all there waiting in the dark. With the map drawn and the target locked, the crew of the Petrel prepared to launch the ROV. As the mechanical explorer began its long, slow descent, the golden sonar images faded, replaced by the piercing blue beams of the ROV's floodlights. It was time to move from the shadows of the sonar into the vivid, terrifying reality of the wreck itself. What the lights were about to reveal would change everything we thought we knew about the forgotten carrier. As the ROV's floodlights sliced through the eternal ink of the Coral Sea, the spectral golden lines of the sonar transformed into a breathtaking reality of cold, dark steel. At 14,000 feet, the ocean is a different world. There is almost no oxygen here, no light, and very little life. This environmental hostility, paradoxically, is the greatest conservator of history. It has turned the USS Wasp into a museum of steel, a place where the clock stopped at 1942 and the atmosphere has been frozen in time. The first objects to emerge from the gloom were the ship's teeth, her weapons. If you look at the footage of her 5-inch/38 caliber guns, you aren't looking at a rusted ruin. You are looking at a machine that looks ready to fire. The preservation is so absolute that if you zoom in on the muzzles, you can still see the spiral rifling inside the barrels. On most shipwrecks, decades of salt water would have eaten those grooves away, leaving nothing but a jagged hole. But here, the gun mounts sit proudly on their galleries, the mechanical piping and base mechanisms visible in such high detail that it feels like you've stepped onto a museum ship, just a very dark, very silent one. But it's when the ROV moves to the smaller anti-aircraft batteries that the Wasp's personality truly begins to shine. We see the 20mm Oerlikon cannons guns that were the last line of defense against kamikazes and dive bombers. Their gun shields tell a story of physics and violence. They are buckled and pressed inward not by enemy fire, but by the sheer crushing fist of water pressure as the ship plunged into the abyss. Yet behind these guns, the steel hull remains blackened. These aren't just shadows. They are genuine scorch marks from the 1942 Inferno. It is a haunting realization the paint was burned away by the fire, and because of the depth, the rust hasn't had the chance to heal those scars. The Wasp still carries her battle wounds on the surface of her skin. Then there are the Chicago pianos, the quad 1.1-inch anti-aircraft mounts. These weapons were notoriously temperamental during the war, often jamming at the worst possible moments. On the Wasp, they look pristine. The 4 barrels of each mount are still aligned, pointing defiantly toward a surface they will never see again. Incredibly, the tips of the barrels are almost shiny, catching the ROV's light as if they were polished just yesterday. It is an eerie sight that defies the logic of decay. Perhaps the most significant technical find, however, is a single water-cooled .50 caliber machine gun. To a casual observer, it's just a small gun on a rusted tripod. To a naval historian, it's a holy grail. These weapons were common in the early months of the war, but were quickly phased out and replaced by more powerful cannons. They almost never survive on shipwrecks. Finding one here still mounted to the Wasp's superstructure is like finding a prehistoric insect trapped in amber. It is a physical link to a specific desperate era of American naval history, but the technical deep dive reaches its emotional peak at the bridge. This was the nerve center of the Wasp, the place where Captain Sherman made the agonizing decision to abandon his ship. The bridge is perhaps the most famous image of the wreck, and for good reason. The fire damage here is vivid. You can see where the flames licked out of the windows, searing the steel. The ROV's cameras linger on an open doorway, a dark portal leading into the interior of the ship. We can see the debris on the deck, the scattered remains of what was once a bustling command center. Looking through that door feels like an intrusion on a private tragedy. You expect to see a ghostly hand reach out to close it. The bridge remains a miraculously intact monument to the men who stood their ground while the world around them turned into an oven. Even the flight deck, which we know was gutted by internal explosions, remains technically recognizable. The wooden planks are gone, consumed by the fire, or long since dissolved by the sea, but the underlying steel lattice remains. It's like looking at the skeleton of a giant, revealing the light construction that we talked about earlier. As we move away from the guns and the bridge, we start to notice something strange about the way the metal has failed. We've seen the what, but now we have to look at the how. The Wasp didn't just break. She shattered in a way that suggests her very design, that Achilles' heel of light steel played a role in her final moments on the seabed. As the ROV drifts away from the haunting open windows of the bridge, it glides toward the most geographically jarring feature of the wreck. This is the moment where the Museum of Steel gives way to a scene of inexplicable structural violence. We are looking at the Great Break, the point where the USS Wasp ceased to be a ship and became a fractured monument. In the world of deep-sea shipwrecks, we are used to seeing chaos. When a vessel like the Titanic or the Bismarck hit the bottom, their hulls often crumpled like discarded soda cans, the victim of immense pressure and the sheer kinetic energy of the impact. But the Wasp is different. As the cameras pan across the midsection of the hull, the metal doesn't look crumpled or crushed. It looks as if a giant, invisible blade has sliced through it. The crew of the RV Petrel noted this with immediate fascination, and the break is so clean, so terrifyingly precise, that it has been described as a laser cut. On one side, the hull lies perfectly flat on the seabed. On the other, just inches away across the fracture, the rest of the ship is tilted up at a violent diagonal angle. There is no mangled transition zone. There's only a sharp, jagged line where the steel simply gave up. To understand why this happened, we have to revisit that Achilles heel we discussed earlier, the Washington Naval Treaty, and the compromise of light construction. The Wasp was essentially a heavyweight boxer, built with the bones of a lightweight. When she began her long 2-mile plunge into the abyss, she wasn't just a dead weight. She was a pressurized vessel filled with trapped air, internal fires, and structural voids. As the external water pressure mounted to over 6,000 pounds per square inch, the Wasp reached her breaking point. On a more heavily armored ship like the North Carolina, the thick steel might have buckled or bent. But the Wasp's thin, unarmored skin couldn't bend. It snapped. It was a structural, catastrophic failure. Under the unimaginable weight of the ocean, the ship's spine literally shattered. This is the paradox of the Wasp, her greatest weakness. Her fragile construction is exactly what created her most stunning visual feature. Because the hull snapped so cleanly, the individual sections didn't lose their shape. They didn't telescope or flatten. Instead, they separated like two pieces of a broken toy. If you look closely at the footage of the break, you can see the internal guts of the ship exposed to the lights of the ROV. You can see walkways, ladders, and chain lockers. In one area, the walkway on the flat section comes to a sudden sheared end. Right above it, the corresponding section on the tilted half is raised several feet into the water column. It is a frozen snapshot of the exact millisecond the ship's structural integrity vanished. There is a strange, chilling beauty to this destruction. Because the break was so surgical, it preserved the interior spaces. We can look through the gaps into the hangar deck, the very place where the fires had raged most fiercely 77 years prior. Here, the miraculously intact theme continues. Despite the heat that once melted, aluminum planes on the deck above the internal framing remains standing. We see another break near the superstructure, neatly splitting the ship behind the 1.1-inch gun mounts. It proves that the Wasp didn't just break in one place. She shattered in several, a legacy of a design that prioritized speed and deck space over survivability. But perhaps the most eerie sight in this structural mystery is the way the fire damage interacts with the break. Near the shattered hull plates, you can see the rust patterns. On most ships, rust is a sign of age. But on the Wasp, the rust acts like a map highlighting the areas where the fire burned away the protective paint before the ship ever hit the water. The fire and the pressure worked in tandem to create this wreck. The fire weakened the steel, and the pressure finished the job. The Great Break serves as a reminder that the Wasp was a ship of compromises. She was a vessel built for a war that didn't yet exist, designed under rules that didn't account for the terrifying power of the modern torpedo or the crushing weight of the deep Pacific. But as we move past the shattered hull and out into the surrounding silt, we find that the Wasp didn't just leave behind a broken body. She left behind her crew's last memories and the mechanical birds that were meant to defend her. Moving away from the shattered spine of the hull, the ROV's lights sweep across the barren, featureless silt of the seafloor. It is here in the debris field that the scale of the Wasp's loss becomes truly intimate. We find the Ghost Squadron, the aircraft that were once the pride of her flight deck, now resting as silent sentinels in the mud. Among the most striking images are the remains of a Grumman, TBF Avenger. At this depth, the preservation of the paint is nothing short of supernatural. While the wings may be sheared off and the fuselage twisted by the force of the sinking, the colors remain vivid. You can still see the distinct tricolor scheme on the propeller blades. The transitions from black to yellow to red are as sharp as the day they were painted in a factory back in the States. It is a jarring sight. In a world of monochrome blue and gray, these splashes of color serve as a defiant reminder of the world above. These planes didn't just fall. They were dragged down while fueled, armed, and ready for a fight that never came. But as the ROV continues its patrol, we are reminded that the USS Wasp is not just a feat of engineering or a site for structural analysis. It is a hallowed ground. Beneath the layers of silt and the miraculously intact steel lies a war grave for 193 men sailors and aviators who were caught in the stinging bee's final fiery moments. Every shipwreck has a moment that brings the viewer to a standstill, a moment where the history becomes humanity. For the Wasp, that moment is found on a section of rusted grating near the superstructure. There, resting upside down and alone, is a single steel helmet. It is perhaps the most poignant image ever captured by the Petrel's cameras. It sits there, undisturbed by currents, untouched by scavengers, a lonely vigil kept in the dark for over 80 years. We don't know the name of the man who wore it. We don't know if he was one of the 193 who perished or one of the survivors who had to cast it aside to jump into the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. But in the silence of the abyss, that helmet speaks louder than the 5-inch guns or the massive hull. It is a physical echo of a life, a family, and a sacrifice. This is why we return to these wrecks. We don't go down there to gawp at the carnage or to satisfy a morbid curiosity. We go there because these ships are time capsules of courage. The Wasp was a ship of compromises, built thin to save weight, left unarmored to meet a treaty. But the men who served on her made no such compromises. They fought an uncontrollable inferno until the very metal beneath their feet began to melt. And they stayed at their posts until the ocean itself claimed the deck. The Wasp remains burnt and scarred, but she is miraculously intact in a way that transcends her physical state. She is intact in our collective memory. She is a reminder that even when the steel snaps and the fires consume everything, so the story of what happened that afternoon in 1942 cannot be erased. Exploring these depths is a privilege. And it's a mission that belongs to all of us who care about preserving the truth of our past. If you find value in these deep-sea journeys and believe that the stories of ships like the Wasp and the men who sailed them deserve to be told with the respect they earned, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to shine a light into the darkest corners of the ocean to honor those who never came home. As the ROV's lights finally dim and it begins the long ascent back to the surface, we leave the USS Wasp once again to the crushing pressure and the absolute silence of the deep. She is no longer forgotten. She is home. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.